guys, welcome back to the Questioning Behaviour podcast. This is part 2 of our chat with Colin Camerer. If you haven't listened to part 1, please do so. You'll be able to find it wherever you're listening to this. It's probably below it. And in this episode, we get to continue the discussion about Colin's experience with neuroscience and what he thinks the future will be like. What topics will he be focusing on and what he's excited for? So sit back, grab a cup of tea, and I hope you enjoy our continued talk with Colin Camerer.
So almost all of these interesting challenges, obesity, opioid addiction, online education for poor and rich kids, pandemics, COVID is partly, there's a medical part, there's an epidemiological part, and then there's like a political social part. So I think that's pretty exciting. And I think more private foundations are interested in this kind of thing. I think they tend to think of these as, it's like, I'm not going to make grants to the epidemiologists only if I want to study like when to reopen the economy in a country that's struggling like here. I need to talk to economists. Austin Goolsbee has a new paper basically showing that even when businesses reopened, a lot of people just didn't want to go. Mm-hmm. So it's not just a matter of telling businesses you can open your restaurant again. It's like, how do you get people to go? That's a behavior change, fear, emotion problem, right? It's a big tangle of all these different things.
No, absolutely.
So I think that part of behavioral science is very exciting, is the fact that there's a lot of cooperation, obviously, in nudge units with governments all around the world, but also private companies, firms. I think of it as a Silicon Valley thing, but it's probably not, probably a little bit too local. But I think a lot of firms think of that basically their company is a hypothesis, right? It's a scientific hypothesis about what customers will buy and what competitors will do when, and they're going to test the hypothesis. And if their hypothesis is correct, they become a billionaire.
Wow.
But because they think that way, they're often quite interested in talking to academics about, how do we get people to use the app, or
right,
and there's a kind of hunger. I mean, there's so many people I've met in tech, and I'm not even that well connected, who are just really smart, and they just didn't want to get PhDs. They do other things, and they're program managers and stuff, and they don't always have the same scientific vocabulary, but they pick things up very quickly. They understand establishing causality and, kind of the basic grad school things like sample size and confidence intervals. They have intuitive understanding. They're very data hungry, right? It's like, if we don't see it in data, we don't believe it. We don't see it. It's like, oh, thank you, Jesus.
Is this where you think behavioral science is heading? More data-driven, more tech-driven? Is that the future?
Yeah. I think it's going to be a combination of more better data, mm-hmm. But there's also, and again, the smartest tech people know this too, which is, you can't like make a chart of Fitbit, right? It's like too much stuff. You can't just plot it. I'm just going to plot it, look at a scatter plot, make a regression, and have the answer, right? You have to, what theory and social science tells you is kind of what to look for. Mm-hmm. Right, like when I talk to these folks and I say we're interested in habits, and they're like, "What would you look for in the data that would look like a habit?" And I know exactly what to look for. I want to look for reward prediction error, and a learning rate, and reliability, and then a threshold. And you need a stochastic element, right? Because it may, like with sobriety and with drugs, people may be sober for a long time and then relapse. Often they relapse when they're tempted in some way. So we have a pretty good idea. I mean, the theory is like an imaginary thing, The theory tells us what I would expect data to look like. The data never looks quite exactly like that. But if it's even close, like an R squared of 10%, then, we're on the right track.
Hmm. So should we be looking outside of, should economists be looking outside of economics for theories? Is that sort of the bottom line, right?
So we have a paper on this that just got revised and resubmit decision from PNAS, so hopefully it will come out in a couple of months. And it's basically, it's inspired by the term lingua franca. Lingua franca is an Italian term, I think, for trade language. Lingua, right? So basically what that means is in the 15 or 1600s, the Venetians and then lots of other people traded all over the Mediterranean. And when they would go someplace, they would pick up some spice like cumin, and they're like, "What is this?" Like they had no word in Italian for cumin because they'd never seen it before. And the local people were like, "We call it cumin." Like, okay, we'll call it cumin too, right? So you get this like pidgin language, where if you want to talk about emotion in economics, what you do is you go ask some emotion people. You read a few books if you can. What do they think emotion is? And you use their definition. What you do not do is to say, how does it fit into preferences, beliefs, constraints? It has to be one of those three or some mixture. That's it.
We're back at those three.
That's it. That's our. I don't want to learn any more words. No more words for me. I know. Well, I got all the words I need.
3 is enough. Yeah.
3 words.
Yeah. 3 words. I can do it all. So I think that's completely wrong. It's completely wrong. And so if you want to study emotion, go talk to them about emotion. If you're interested in rational inattention, you should do what Mike Woodford did, which was to go back and read all this beautiful work on efficient coding. And there's really interesting work. Like he pointed me to this. I mean, he's such a wonderful person. He pointed me to this paper about birds. So it turns out that female birds in mating season like improve how accurately they can hear male bird calls. Because it's like, this is the time to pay attention. You know?
Amazing.
The birds are like, yeah, whatever. And it's like, oh, time to mate. What did you say? Oh, really? You know? They turn on attention, right? And again, if you think about this functionality, as well as, you know, sort of cognitive flexibility, right? You would think that birds have this like hardwired, you know, but it's actually, it's exactly like the scarcity, right? Now is not the time to be ignoring the males. We can do them the rest of the year, but now we have to find a mate.
Human dating, really similar.
Yeah, exactly. Like marriage, just hearing loss.
Oh, I see.
Anyway, so you know, so Mike's work, it's kind of like he's like, I read all this stuff and I kind of took all the good stuff I could. And in his papers, you know, he if you study the things he wants to study, he wants you to learn all this stuff as kind of like background knowledge. Another example I think is a cool one is social networks. So the social network is an idea that came from sociology and basically applied math. But clearly the kind of big push came from sociology. Sociologists thought of the network as a fundamental, you know, unit of organization. Way before any economist ever did. Economists are like, well, you got households, markets, individuals.
Yeah, 3 things again.
And firms. Yeah, exactly. Network. Who cares?
Yeah.
But economists like Matt Jackson got drawn into thinking about networks in the 90s, which was, you know, 20 or 30 years after, like Mark Granovetter's important paper on the strength of weak ties was, I think, 1978, right? And his point was that the title tells you everything you need to know, is that even if you're weakly linked to different people, that could have big consequences, blah, blah, blah. And so Matt Jackson and others came along and said, wow, this network is a mathematical object, which had been known for a long time, you know, that there's mathematical interesting structure. And one thing the sociologists hadn't figured out was, how do you endogenize the network? Like if it's costly to make a network link, but a link has some kind of value, what networks would sort of emerge in equilibrium?
Yeah.
And I remember in around 91, I was at I was back at Chicago Business School on the faculty, and there was a lot of network sociologists working there, a lot. Really, really great, interesting work. And somebody presented this thing about, well, there's 3 kinds of networks. And I said, can you endogenize which one would naturally form? And it's like, oh, I don't know how to do that. But like Matt Jackson knows how to do that. First, he's very smart. And it turns out that, you know, if you take a few tricks from game theory and then you add in a few special things, I mean, it's real, you have to have some real insight, right? The sociologist didn't tell you exactly what to do. And then that becomes a big contribution. So now social networks are an active area of research in economics, but partly it's quite successful because Matt has a popular, really great book on this too, basically took the object exactly as the sociologists and the applied mathematicians had thought of it. He didn't mess it up. Yeah, all he put in was that forming a link is costly. Okay, no problem. Again, it's scarcity, right? You'd like to have 1 million friends, but your text messages would be too crowded. Your group text would be too crowded.
Facebook doesn't allow for it. Facebook, I think, has a maximum of 5,000, and that's it.
Oh, really? Yeah, there you
It
go.
has a
Right. So there's a hard constraint. And so they kind of took all that was known from sociology and didn't try to like make up their own thing. And they took a lot of the language and the frameworks and then were able to add something to it. So when economists have been like good traders, in the sense of finding things from other fields, it's been pretty successful. It's just that sometimes I think they're not, in a way, not humble enough to say, tell me how you think about something, and then I'm going to use it in my. I'm going to respect the fact that you thought about emotion for 80 years, or your field did, or you thought about social networks. Duncan Watts thought about social networks for 20 years, or Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman thought about the perceptual basis of probability for 5 years.
Yeah.
So, Colin, tell me, what have you been thinking about for at least 5 years, or what are you currently working on? And
okay.
Working on for the next 5 years?
Yeah. So actually, I think I'm only going to work on 3 things for the rest of my career, but who knows?
Again, grounded in economics, only 3 things.
Well, they're big things. Wait till you hear. They're big things. And also, I'm very frustrated with economics publishing. Publishing journal articles has been very frustrating. The acceptance rates are down to 5%. That means that they're rejecting a lot of good papers. But meanwhile, PNAS and Science, and there's a new journal, 3 years old, called Nature Human Behavior, which is sort of a general science journal, which is great. That one came along at just the right time, and they really are interested in a mixture of. They publish a bit of imaging, large scale. These kind of large-scale database analyses of different things. So new journals are kind of common, sort of fill in the gap. Okay, here's the 3 things: habit, we talked about, salience, and supernormalization. And salience, what we have been working on. This is another example, I think, of where economists have discovered salience.
Good for
in
them.
the sense that Christopher Columbus discovered America. Wasn't there before.
Right.
Although he thought he was in India, so he called the natives Indians. But
Yep.
he
Right.
He gets too much
something.
credit, that guy. He gets too much credit, I think we do.
Exactly, yes. Anyway, so economists have become interested in salience, and partly it's related to attention and different things, and that's great. And there are a few simple theories that are kind of inspired by how attention theorists think about salience. But what we did is something that's new. It's new to us. So in computer vision, there are a lot of algorithms that have been carefully accumulated starting in about 2000 to now. And you show somebody an image, and the algorithm predicts where a typical person will look in the first few seconds.
Okay.
For any image, color, black and white, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And the algorithms are free. You just download it. I mean, they're not that simple. You'd have to, it's just Python, and you have to try a few things. So we used it to study what's called Schelling matching games.
Yes.
And hider seeker. So you show people a picture, and Schelling in 1960 was interested in what he called focal points, or psychologically prominent points. So we basically show people a picture, and in the matching condition, we tell them you have to pick a pixel and press your mouse. We're going to draw a circle around the pixel. Another person's going to do it at the same time. We're going to draw a circle. If the circles overlap, you matched, and you get $1. So you want to pick whatever somebody picks, knowing they want to pick what you're going to pick.
Yes.
And visual salience makes a prediction. It's like, you see this, one of the pictures is a person holding an owl, and you can see the owl's eyes, and there's a kind of a contrast between the person's hand and then they have this dark thing on their wrist, to protect them from the owl. So contrast, color, things that are in the center. There's a few basic things that are called low-level, bottom-up salient features. Those are what almost everybody looks at in the first couple of seconds. That's what's in the algorithm. Okay. And so you can predict quite accurately. Like in these images, if there's one salient hotspot, like the owl's eyes, they'll pick that about 85% of the time. And if there's a whole bunch of hotspots that are sprinkled around, right, like there's no one thing that's salient, like a big crowd or a complicated forest, then they only match about 15% of the time. So you can get a full range of matching from almost perfect to almost completely random. If they just choose randomly, it's a base of 7%. And that's one answer to Schelling's question of what's focal, which is if I look at something in the first couple seconds, I somehow have a feeling that you're probably looking at it too. And if the question is what are we both looking at, and so that we should choose the most location, the answer is what's visually salient, what's bottom up, low level feature visually salient. And more interestingly, we also studied hider seeker. So the same images, if you're a hider, you want your circle to not overlap, and if you're a seeker, you want the circle to overlap. And that's much more interesting in a way, because now you don't want to choose the visually salient spot if you're hiding.
Sure.
You want to choose what's like anti-salient, right? But our visual system is not really designed to pick out anti-salients, right? It's designed to see what's there, right? So you have to almost like driving in reverse. You have to say, look at the thing no one's looking at. Look at the thing no one's, and the brain is not well equipped to do this. So as a result, the seekers kind of catch the hiders more often than they should game theoretically. Game theoretically, in the hider-seeker game, there's a unique equilibrium. Everyone should choose randomly across all of the locations. That's the best thing you could do if you're trying to hide. And if the hider does that, the seeker can't do any better.
Yeah, that's good to know. Not remotely my strategy for winning this game, but then again, I'm a psychologist, so probably not my game.
That was my strategy.
Well, it's sort of the defensive strategy, right? It's the defensive strategy if you're a hider is to not pick, is to pick everything and just hope I don't get caught. So that's pretty cool because and then we have a hidden Markov model using eye tracking data, which sort of shows us do you go from a salient spot to an unsalient spot or another salient spot, and we actually have a timing of when exactly that happens. So it turns out if they take 2.5 seconds to play, the seekers win 9% of the time. They should win 7%, so they win a little bit more. Okay. And if we cut the time down to 400 milliseconds, our model predicts that the seekers will win more often because the hider doesn't have a time to find an unsalient hiding place.
Sure.
Right? And we have an exact numerical prediction. It's parameter free because once you fit the hidden Markov model, that does have a lot of free parameters. But once you fit it, you have this curve of seeker win rate as a function of time. And so we just ran some which they had to go much quicker. And when they do it in 400 milliseconds, we predict, I think 70% seeker wins, and it's actually 15%. That's pretty good. And the magic of this is that these visual salience guys, and actually it's a woman from Marcel Conia from Italy, whose algorithm we're using, or her team, they figured out visual salience for us. And now we just have to figure out how is that useful in economics? Well, we can study focality. We can study hider-seeker. We can figure out why the seekers win too often.
Are you only interested in visual salience, not like memory salience or any other type of salience?
Well, it's basically. I mean, I think there's plenty to do with visual salience. It's certainly not that there's all there is to salience. So salience is sometimes just used as an all-purpose word for anything that's getting a lot of your attention. Mm-hmm. So it could be a memory, it could be a sound, right? All these things are going to have different sort of sensory saliency properties.
But for you, it's your focus on.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the visual is so easy to use, and now we spend a lot of time learning about it. Okay. It's so easy to do experiments, right? Because the visual system works very quickly, so you can do these things really. You can do hundreds of trials. They're kind of interesting. The games are kind of fun to play. In theory, you can do things with children pretty easily. They're very portable. You could do these on an iPad and some remote village if you're studying anthropology. And you can also alter the images, right? So what we're working on now is we have a SQL paper that uses price charts and stocks, and at the end of their actual stock price charts, and at the end they have to decide whether they're going to invest for the future. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that what they look at visually predicts a little bit of what they invest in later. That was a real surprise because I just didn't think that would necessarily work in the same way. The algorithms are not designed; they're just designed to say what people look at in the first couple of seconds, whether it's a Zoom background, supermarket, ocean. They're trained on like thousands of images of all kinds of different things. Mm-hmm. So the fact that it works a little bit for stocks is pretty neat.
For sure.
And so the other thing you can do with visual, because of Photoshop and what have you, is you can create any images you want, right? So what we're going to do next with the stock prices, for example, is to artificially create. You create a stock price series, then you run it through this algorithm, and it tells you where people look. Then you predict whether they're going to buy or not, and we can kind of handcraft very attractive looking stocks that people would like to invest in.
Sure.
By the visual features, and we should be able to do that. I mean, so in other words, once you have this algorithm in hand, you can feed in hundreds of different photoshopped versions, and then see, do people look differently? If you put and we know a fair amount, like faces often grab attention. If you put a face in, people will look at that. And essentially what designers who make advertisements do is they do this all the time.
Yep.
Or if you make a billboard, you're basically in the business of engineering salience or attracting salience or whatever, right? So we're going to do the same thing.
Imagine someone in a marketing agency suddenly calling themselves a salience engineer.
Salience engineer, yeah.
Job
title. CSOs, Chief Salience Officers.
Oh,
that's it.
Chef's kiss. Very nice.
Now I have to start a company just to call myself the CSO.
Let me know when you start a company. We'll give you a shout out. We'll market your services.
You have to invest. That's the hard part. Okay. You can help us market. You can be assistant CSO.
Can I be the CBO? Another up and coming term.
Yes.
Excellent.
And actually, people have been. One thing that's been nice about visual salience is people have been really excited about it because, you can literally see how it works. I think before I looked at these algorithms, and my student actually found one. Originally we were using one that was about 10 years old. And this is another example, I think, of what we were talking about where behavioral scientists need to get to know your neighbors.
Yeah.
Right? So she took a couple of courses in applied math, and she knew some people who were studying computer vision, and she's what are the latest things on visual salience? And suddenly she's got 18 papers to read, and in an hour she was immediately right on the frontier of where visual salience studies are.
She can read 18 papers in an hour, even I can't.
Well, I think she read the right one.
Oh, excellent.
Or maybe it was 18 hours. It may have been 18 hours, but anyway, pretty rapidly, she was able to kind of get right on the frontier. It's not like we live in some special island where the computer vision people all live. At your universities, you could find somebody probably within 20 minutes who's interested in visual salience and could help you out.
I can do it in 2 seconds. I already have someone in mind.
Well, exactly, and Warwick is a place that celebrates this, in Nottingham too. You're kind of unusually, mixing psychological and economic experiments and DDM and stuff. So it's just having the idea. It's essentially having the humility to say, maybe I should ask people who thought about salience, and then a little bit of luck and local. I knew about this because Christoph Koch had done some of the original work on this, and so I kind of knew about his work because we knew each other from some project. So there's just a little bit like you're at a barbecue with your neighbor, and it turns out your neighbor does some interesting thing. And we have a small village, so we get to know what other scientists are doing pretty easily.
Fair enough.
But it's not impossible. So visual salience has been exciting. So and there are a ton of things you could study. In fact, we're sort of collecting examples of nudges where the essence of the nudge is visual salience. So a classic example is the fly in the men's urinal at the Schiphol airport in Amsterdam. Somebody painted this little fly.
Schiphol, I'll never forget it.
Schiphol. Yeah. I don't know if they probably don't have it in the women's. I don't know. Anyway.
Why would they?
So that's an example where we have a picture. We haven't done it yet, but we have a picture, and we're going to run it through this algorithm, and we're just gambling, or we're optimistic that the algorithm will say people look at the fly. because there's a lot of dark light contrast. Contrast is what the eye is often looking for to see like the boundaries of objects. Where do you go from dark to light? And it's kind of in the center. It's sort of placed in just the right spot from the point of view of visual salience, I think. And again, whether the designer was doing that in a conscious way or whether the designers just have their own abstract principles, that are similar to the algorithms. They have their own tricks and know-how.
Right.
So I think that I don't know if we're gonna write a whole paper. We're just sort of stockpiling examples of where nudges are essentially salience manipulations.
Okay, cool.
I kind of love that, because one of the things with nudges that has always slightly frustrated me, but also left me a bit like wanting more, is that there's just no real discussion about the mechanisms. Like, no one has much clue. It's just sort of speculating in the dark that, we think that this happened because, I don't know, loss aversion, or it created an emotional response. So, I guess neuroeconomics could provide very interesting answers to the questions of mechanisms. But I need to get into this field, essentially, is what I'm saying.
Okay, we're waiting. Yeah, exactly. And often when there are discussions of mechanisms, they're again a little bit, they're using the sort of right words, but without the full force. So people will say things like, well, this seemed to get people's attention, or this was memorable. Well, memory is something you can measure. True. And attention is something you can measure. True. Why stop with the word, right? When we have these lots of techniques. I know that Tim Mullett
was the person I was thinking of earlier when we talked about visual salience. I can find him in
exactly. So actually, he and I were talking about this because we have some work with Neil and him on DDM, and I think he said that the DCA or whatever one of the financial authority regulators were interested in DCA. Using salience to kind of design disclosure forms and things like that. It's a very obvious, starter case. It shouldn't be too difficult. It's not clear that these low-level algorithms are going to be that useful because it's not going to tell you like whether, but it might tell you, for example, if something's in a certain place in the form, or there's a certain font or color. Like if you have a black and white form and something is in red, people will see the red thing for sure. Right. Whether they would then, make better financial decisions, that's a whole other. That's the next part of the story, right? How does the salience then? But so far we have games and markets, and visual salience, even though it's not at all designed, and the people who are doing that are not just bottom up. They're using what we call top-down processes. Like they're specifically trying to figure out a place to hide, a place that someone else might hide, whether by a stock. They're not just like, oh, red, oh, eyes, oh, faces. So it's
surprisingly, they're not like that, Colin.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the key is that you really you can't inhibit the visual salience, even if you want to, like the hiders.
Right.
So even if your attention is being directed in a more top-down way because you have a certain goal, that's great. That's a whole other class of research. Most of the research of attention is actually about that. It's not in these algorithms, but you can put it in lots of other ways. You can always make your own algorithm or combine things.
Cool.
So I think that one's been good. And a final fun thing about that was we presented this at a finance conference and a webinar, a Zoom. And a couple of days later, we got an email from one of the editors of one of the good finance journals called Review of Financial Studies, saying, could you submit your paper to us? We can't guarantee we're going to publish it, but I saw it. I thought it was very interesting. The main editor, there's a hierarchy of editors. The main editor thought it was really neat, and we're going to try to get it in the hands of knowledgeable referees who are sympathetic and understand what you're trying to do. Blah blah blah. And that's only happened twice in my career, so that was very exciting. In fact, that was really nice because finance can be very finance it's a very serious field, but as a result, it's hard to publish. The top journals are like 5 or 10%. They're fast. They're really fast, which is good, unlike in many areas of economics. But I think they have a kind of taste like an expiration bonus. I think the journal editors always complain we don't get enough really interesting new papers.
All right.
But sometimes when
I will move into finance.
Well,
I'm happy.
They always say that. Now the problem is they often get them, and then the referees don't like them, and then the editor's like, well, I can't really rule the referees. But anyway, so this is a very exciting thing, and actually, I think we're going to send it today. It's almost done.
Ooh, exciting stuff. Now, besides this, we've actually also mentioned a third topic you're probably going to study for at least the upcoming 5 years, and you said it very quickly. It sounded to me like super normalizing, although I'm pretty sure I've misheard it.
Yes.
Oh, I got it right.
No, that's it.
What is it?
That's it. Okay, super normalization. It's wild. So Nico Tinbergen and Konrad Lorenz discovered this in the 30s, and basically what it is the theory is that if your perception isn't great, animals will be attracted to objects that have high evolutionary value.
Sure.
And which are not normal, but are actually super normal. So I'll give you two examples. One is cute, and the other is spectacular.
Oh.
The cute example is eggs. So it turns out the birds. I think it's well established that if you lay a larger egg, the chick in that egg is more likely to survive.
Okay.
So the birds kind of like bigger eggs.
Sure.
And so what happens is if you take a regular egg size and you make an artificial egg that's bigger and you put it in the nest, the mother will sit on that egg. It's like, now this is a chick, right?
Wow.
That's example one. And there's a whole string of these examples from Tinbergen. They're just one after the other. It's just beautiful. Example two is called jewel beetle. So there's a type of beetle in Australia called jewel beetle. And evolutionarily, this is just a fact of the intro to jewel beetles. The females are bigger than the males, like that size. Oh. And they have a kind of a brown, amber, beautiful sort of orange-brown color. And on the back, the carapace on the beetle's back, it has these sort of like lumps, kind of like a golf ball.
Oh, interesting.
Right, they're little dots. Right. So it turns out that somebody in Australia made a brand of beer, I think called Emu. And the Emu bottle is orange and brown, and it has dots. And it's about that big. It's about triple the size of a female jewel beetle. So somebody noticed that an emu bottle was in the desert, and there was about 8 male jewel beetles surrounding it, trying to mate with this bottle.
Oh my gosh.
That's great. That's the best thing I've heard.
Because in their little minds, this beer bottle is like the perfect female.
Bigger is better.
It's a jewel beetle sex doll.
Oh.
It is. It's a jewel beetle sex toy. It is a jewel beetle sex doll. Yeah. The jewel beetles are like, gosh. I've seen some females in my life, but whoa, and there are many, many examples.
Amazing.
So that's called supernormalization. The idea is that some exaggerated feature, which is associated with evolutionary value, like mate value or the egg quality, attracts these animals. And the whole question of this bit of research I'm thinking about is, are we as dumb as the jewel beetle?
Oh. Are you currently running that research? Because I want details. I want conclusions. I need to know.
It's gonna be very, very cool. I've literally been talking about it for years, and I haven't been able to get like a group of students to really sink their teeth into it. And the other thing that's important for humans is, so no, we're not as dumb as jewel beetles in general, but
because we can recognize a beer bottle.
Yeah, we can tell. But we're also, as a species, we're able to manufacture, right? Even if we have a slight tendency towards supernormalization, right? Like much less than the beetles and the birds, we're able to manufacture stimuli like precision tuned to attract supernormalized interest. And then the question is, what are they? One thing I would love to tackle, but it's going to be very messy in economics, is the question about kind of welfare. Like if, as an analyst, you would say the jewel beetle's welfare is harmed by the introduction of these beer bottles.
Sure.
Right? They're not having more sex.
No.
In fact, it's actually very dangerous, because what happens is they're so fascinated by the beer bottle that other animals that prey on the beetles come up and like chew them to death.
Okay. That's not what I expected.
So these beer bottles are not a good thing for them, right? So if the jewel beetle, but meanwhile, like we have opioid production. Maybe opioids are like the beer bottles. Beer bottles are to jewel beetles what opioids are to humans.
Okay, not an analogy I would naturally come up with, but a good analogy to start with.
Well, we have a long list.
Okay. I'm still confused with the opioids one. How is an opioid making me more attractive to others?
Is it about self-control?
Oh, yeah. So it's not. Yeah. It's that the view is that our system didn't evolve like an immunity to drugs that get us high.
Okay. I mean,
which is why they get us high.
Give the Dutch a while, we'll get there.
It's the combination of getting us high and being highly addictive.
Right.
So right.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we have a bunch of examples from Made Choice cosmetics, high heels. There are a ton of interesting examples from Made Choice. Mostly women doing things to super normalize physical cues of like youth and fertility. That's the theory. It's very evolutionary. That part of it is very like hardcore evolutionary psychology.
Because now if I'm doing my makeup or I'm buying clothes or whatever, anything with my appearance,
you're doing research.
I'm doing research, but even better, I can tell people that I'm super normalized.
Super normalized. Yeah, you can say I'm super normalized today.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah. So there's actually a lot of examples. The male examples are. I think it's probably just the culture of the field, but there are a lot of examples in evolution and human behavior type journals about that are. Here's a really wild one, and a lot of these are. One fun thing with humans is kind of like the jewel beetles. Some of these are pretty subconscious, so you may be attracted to something that's super normalized without necessarily knowing, like consciously, why that is. So here's a wild example. Around your the pupil of your eye, there's something called the liminal ring.
Okay.
And if you see a close-up, you'll see it. And it's basically like a little strip, just a circle, like it's dark. And when you're young, it's dark. And as people age, it gets lighter.
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of things change when people age. And almost all those things that change, particularly for females, are going to be, it's going to be like a decreasing cue to youth and fertility. That's the idea. And so they did an experiment with both men and women, and they took faces, and they artificially colored the liminal ring, so it's either darker or lighter.
Mm-hmm.
And then they asked people to just judge the attractiveness. That's it.
Wow.
And when you look at them, you can barely tell the difference. If you look at two of them side by side, you can kind of see.
Sure.
But first if I showed you, I said, you see the liminal ring? What is that? Like,
sure.
You have to really know exactly what you're looking for. And the effects are huge. And interestingly, they're not very sex specific. So when women look at female pictures, you get this effect. And it's the exact same picture, except for this tiny little feature.
I'm buying contact lenses as we speak.
Well, exactly. So you could buy a contact lens with a darker liminal ring.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know. Now, it could be, the other thing is, some of these these papers aren't always in the strongest journals. So some of them may be kind of p-hacked, or I don't know if there's 20 papers on this liminal ring hypothesis. I mean, it sounded very interesting and plausible to me when I taught it in my class and I read the papers. But some of the research quality is very, very good. And some of it, you'd just like to see a lot more studies.
Fair enough.
And see studies in. So we have a long list of things that involve possible supernormalization. And this is another topic that I've talked about it twice. And two things are notable. One is that people were really curious. And economists are often skeptical of stuff. Like if they think things aren't rational, it's like, well, if you pay people more money, And I was like, if you pay the jewel beetles more money, nothing's happening.
Yeah. They still do eaten because they're distracted by a beer bottle.
Yeah, exactly. They're willing to die to mate with this beer bottle, right? Like,
you can't rationalize
so a lot of
that.
Exactly. A lot of the usual pushback about like, well, what if people learn, or what if markets could take over? So this is a topic that economists I've talked to just like to consume. It's like, that's really interesting. The big question is, okay, how are you going to do economics now? Are you going to study certain markets? And we haven't really figured out kind of a killer app for that, except for sort of obvious ones like advertising. Content is going to super normalize properties of goods and things like that. The other thing that's cool is a little bit like visual salience. None of the audiences we've talked to have heard of these algorithms from Cornea.
Mm-hmm.
Andre Schleifer and others who've been interested in salience, Bordalo, Giannoli, and Schleifer have several beautiful papers on this. And they knew about the Itti and Koch papers, and that was kind of like what inspired the approach they have, which is that extreme things get higher weight. But the Cornea one is kind of brand new. I mean, my Xiaomin just kind of discovered it because she knew somebody who knew this area really, really, really well. But the supernormalization, I've only had one person in the times I presented it and talked to my science team who had even heard of the word.
It's a novelty to me as well, if I'm completely honest.
Yeah.
I'm like super invested in all fields, next to behavioral science. But yeah, it's I've never heard of it before, but it sounds... Isn't there secretly like a different term for it that like everybody else uses?
I don't think so. There may be some alternative terms. I mean, I actually had a British student, Helen Roy, who worked on this for a year, just basically collecting examples, and we also tried to go in and we took the example of food.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of supernormalization with food is that we have these kind of food preferences in which we have proxy attributes, like if something tastes good on our tongue, it probably is nutritional. But food manufacturers have found a way to make things that taste good on your tongue
very unhealthy,
and are cheap, which often means not nutritional.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the leading example of where the foods are super normalized, in the sense that it's designed to kind of trick you into perceptually thinking, oh, this is going to be good for me, this is going to be good for me, but it may or may not be nutritionally good for you. So she did a bunch of reading on food science and trying to understand how that worked. But it's a weird. What I probably should do is just write an essay describing all this stuff and just say, I don't know what this has to do with economics or what. I mean, what it is they're really going to want to see a model.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is your model? And it's going to be a model in which you have these sort of like evolved preferences for certain things, and then imperfect perception. And then in equilibrium, the product you buy is actually a product that's not that good for you in terms of your evolved preferences, because you mistakenly think it's good for you, like the jewel beetles and fatty foods and stuff like that.
If you write that essay, you might want to make sure a bunch of psychologists or like people who are like classically trained in psychology read it, because I feel like there is a psychological term for this. I feel like I've heard this before. It might not be the exact same thing, and this is now really starting to bug me.
Well, if you figure it out, it could be. I mean, we've read a little bit at advertising, food. I think in the food literature they may have their own term for this. Oh. There's like dead empty calories, they call it. Where you're actually consuming a lot of calories, but you're not getting nutrition from the calories. Mm-hmm. So they have the, but the idea that it all comes from this combination of evolutionary importance and imperfect perception. And it's so, I mean, every year I give this speech to the grad students. It's like, this is a perfect thesis topic. You'll become famous.
Unfortunately, no success yet.
Well, the problem is we don't have that many students, and I think what I'm going to do is write a grant and try to get some money to fund like a postdoc or somebody just to work on this for 1 or 2 years and just like dig deep into it.
Okay, so if anyone's listening that is interested.
Yes, if anyone is interested, email me.
Yeah, I think Merle has been talking for ages about trying to find a topic where she can combine her love of cosmetics and the beauty industry and psychology and economics and neuroscience. And I think this might be it, Merle.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Me.
Yeah. No, it's actually I'll look at the draft of a paper we have. If it's in okay shape, I can send you the draft. You can see. We didn't say too much about. A lot of it's about food and advertising, entertainment. We kind of go through a series of things. it's one of these things where when you read about it and think about it, and you have a kind of mental model in your head of what you see it everywhere.
Right.
I want to do some. I literally we have this stuff in our Dropbox is so insane. So comic books, for example, right? So superheroes, it has the word super, right? Usually the superheroes have a skill which is valuable, and interestingly, a lot of comic books have been proposed that didn't succeed. So you sort of have, it's almost like the beer bottles, right? You have a long series. There are other beer bottles that don't look like jewel beetles that the male jewel beetles like have no interest in. Like that product didn't take off, you know. And so there are a lot of comic books where the super normalized skill either was too super that it was ridiculous, or it wasn't really valuable, or it wasn't drawn correctly, right? The physical drawing it actually is important because it's got to be visually obvious, like with the jewel beetle, you know, the way that thing is actually built is it looks like a female beetle or not. So whoever works on this has to study the history of comic books.
Oh my gosh, amazing.
And we found some websites that had pretty good information. They didn't necessarily have sales, so it's kind of, you have to sort of piece together. Even though all this great data is coming out in the world, like big data, I don't know if we're going to have enough comic book data, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of, health and fintech data coming out. If you're willing to work with that, I can help you with that, hopefully.
I could talk for hours about this. It's been so interesting.
No, that was a good place to start. I love talking about the things I think some famous film director was asked, "What's your favorite movie of yours?" And they said, "It's the one I'm making right now." Oh. It's always like the one you're in the middle of. And so Salience, I'm very happy because we took something beautifully developed by other scientists, plug it right in, and economists have been curious about that, so that's good. That's what we're trying to do. And then the rest, is ongoing.
Well, absolutely fascinating. A fascinating journey into behavioral science, and the future is super interesting, and it gives me so much hope as a young researcher that there is still so much out there.
And actually, Dick Thaler and I have been talking about this too. That there's a lot of behavioral economics got a little stuck on Tversky and Kahneman, which wasn't a bad place to start because they had a lot of good ideas. And Tversky was very mathematical; that was helpful. Danny was very interested in attention and more basic psychological concepts, but there's hindsight bias is a really powerful one that has been understudied a little bit, which is really important. It may be one of the most persistent biases. It's kind of hard to get rid of. Attention, again, these economists have kind of discovered, and so a lot of cool stuff is happening there. There's a lot of categories of things in psychology that are that haven't been fully kind of pulled in. A good time to be young.
Oh, well, yes. There's other issues, plaguing us, like an over-competitive labor market and a pandemic.
Yes. Yeah, actually, that this year is not a good time. It's not a good time to be 2020 academicing or anything. But hopefully we'll get through.
Yeah, we'll have to.
How much of a choice do we have? None.
Yes. Well, the last thing we always like to ask is, where can people keep up to date with your work and keep track of what you're doing? Are you able to be found on social media or
yes.
or not? Yes.
So we have a new website that's a little bit behind called Camerer Group.
Oh, our group.
Camerer Group, and I'm on Twitter. I love Twitter. Twitter to me is like curated sections of science, a little bit of politics, and complaining about American politics. Caltech, a lot of cool things come out at Caltech that are not at all related to what I do because it's a big science institution. It's CF Camerer on Twitter.
Perfect.
CFCAM.
Oh, don't worry, Colin. We'll most definitely find you on Twitter and put you in the description. I'm pretty sure Sarah and I are both following you on Twitter already.
Yes, I see you on there sometimes.
Cool.
Oh, amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time, Colin. It was amazing to speak with you.
Great, it was my pleasure. Yeah, that was very fun. Good. Thanks for having me.
Okay, and that was part 2 of us talking to Colin Camerer, or if we're being really honest, Colin Camerer giving us one hell of an education, because I feel like I've just been in the most intense yet educational lecture of my life. Sarah, how are you feeling?
I'm feeling sort of inspired, overwhelmed, excited. I mean, all I really want to do now is try and pick up a book or an online course and really get into neuroscience, because
For sure.
it's so interesting. I mean, so Colin was telling us about what the 3 areas that he's now going to focus on solely in his career. So habits, salience, and supernormalization. Well, talk about being able to sort of predict the future. I mean, these 3 things seem highly interesting. I mean, the fact that he can say these are the only things I'm going to look at in the future is kind of crazy. But
Well, yeah, well, he says he's gonna look at those for the rest of his life or the rest of his career, you know? I mean, people are fickle beings. Maybe after 5 years, he's like, yeah, nah, I'm done with it. I'm going back to studying money, which in that case, I would be very supportive of that move.
Yeah, money's old news. Money's old news.
Rude.
Come on.
Rude.
Supernormalization's where it's at. Evolutionary biology and
Clearly.
and theories of it's just fascinating. Oh, but yeah.
You feel like you've had an education, don't you?
I do, and I do have to say, Colin, thank you so much for speaking to us. It felt like really kind of amazing that Colin would, sit down and talk to us, and it's very generous with his time. So yeah, we both really appreciate it.
No, absolutely.
And yeah, that's I don't even know what to say. I'm just sort of
I feel
basking
like
in it.
Oh yeah, I'm same. I'm glowing. I'm lit from within with all this knowledge almost. But I feel like the thing here, what I really enjoyed is just, I mean, obviously Colin has seen the field develop like properly from being like the black sheep of the family that no one wants to have for Thanksgiving dinner. Yeah, American reference. To being the smarty pants 5-year-old nephew who you're like, yeah, I think this kid is going places. We're not sure where, but places. And I feel like that's a good development, and I'm eager for it. But the thing that I enjoyed most is just that, so many like people who have now won Nobel Prize winners, and people who I wouldn't be surprised if they ended up winning Nobel Prizes within the next, decade or so, have just casually met up for like a coffee date. Like, I'm like, okay, can we do that again? Like, can I get invited to that? Is there another round table? Like, I'll fly to the States for that. That's no issue. But it's just such a cool idea. I mean, this sounds a bit dumb because obviously Colin has been, young, but it's just to see the trajectory. Yeah, it sounds so dumb, but to see it is bizarre. But to see the trajectory of someone who's like such a titan, such a giant in the field, and that's not a joke about your weight, Colin. That's whatever. It's just so interesting to see how that trajectory goes, and that it's just a bunch of people who got really interested in something that deviated from what the field initially was, then started mixing it up with different fields, economics and finance meet psychology, or they meet evolutionary psychology or evolutionary biology, and then they meet neuroscience, and then it just goes from there, and it's just, I love it.
Yeah, no, I always love speaking to guests who can give us like a recent history lesson as to, where was the field 10, 15, 20 years ago and how far have we come. I love all of that because, that's not the stuff that necessarily gets talked about or is known yet. Maybe in like 50 years when someone writes a book about the history of, because it will be in the far history, we'll get it. But I feel like we're getting a sneak peek, which is, of the recent past, which is always really exciting.
Yeah, it's cool stuff for sure. And in other cool stuff, I feel like, I should probably look into what super normalization is. It sounds pretty cool. I haven't heard much about it. Maybe that's because it's a new topic, or as a psychologist, maybe I know it under a different name. But I feel like it's going to be a cool topic to do some digging into. So I feel like that is for the next thing on my to-do list. Dive into super normalization.
Yeah, super normalization is the type of topic where you wake up at 3 a.m. with an idea and think, oh my God, that's too crazy, and forget to write it down, and then you forget it. So if anyone out there who is also kind of struck by this idea of supernormalization and wants to try and search for examples in real life, get in touch with us on social media. I'd love to see what you come up with. This area is so ripe for new developments. So get stuck in and get in touch with us. We'd love to hear more.
Yeah. And I think on that note, again, thanks, Colin, so much for the lecture. It was great. It was absolutely lit. But yeah, this is it for the two-parter episode. I hope you really enjoyed it. I hope you thought it was just as educational as we did, or at least thought-provoking or entertaining, as always. If you want to sound off about it, please do reach out via the social medias, and make sure to also check out Colin on Twitter, where I know for a fact he's very, very active and very, very approachable, so that's all good. Guys, thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope you have a great week.